How do you handle emotions at work? Hey everyone, it's the Cope and Chill podcast, your place for practical approaches to self-care and self-healing for better emotional and mental health and well-being. And I'm your host, Ron Martin. Thank you for being here. Okay, I've been teasing this for a few weeks now, but next Monday, I'm very excited. It's finally here. I will be rolling out my first weekly meditation for you. And you'll be able to listen to it exclusively on YouTube at Cope and Chill. And there will be a new meditation each week that you can listen to help you relax, handle stress, start your day, and for promoting healing and well-being in general. Each week will be a different focus. And you can listen as many times as you feel is helpful for free on our YouTube channel at Cope and Chill. I'll post a link in the show notes. Also, I'm still planning on providing downloadable PDF show summaries to serve as written companions to each episode. I've heard some of the feedback, and I'm hoping that these show summaries will help make things a bit easier to internalize and remember. So stay tuned for more information on this. This is coming, I promise. As always, you can check us out on Instagram at Cope and Chill or on Facebook, our page, the Cope and Chill podcast page, and as I just mentioned, on our YouTube channel at Cope and Chill. And of course, as always, our website, copeandchill.com. Please subscribe, tell a friend, leave a comment, and give us a like. It helps the show to grow and helps us to get better. Thank you for everything that you do and for being here with us. Let's talk about how to handle emotions at work. This week, I'll be talking with Andrew Lang. Andrew is an educator in the Pacific Northwest, an alumnus of Richard Rohr's Living School for Action and Contemplation, and author of Unmasking the Inner Critic, Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. Along with writing regularly, he facilitates workshops helping people to navigate their inner lives and explore their sense of identity and spirituality. You can find more of his writings and offerings at his website, www.andrewglang.com. So it's andrewglang.com. When coming up with the title for this episode, my original conversations with Andrew centered around what's called embodiment and the connection between our inner lives and how we show up in the world. Andrew has a very strong community focus in terms of how he lives his life. He's worked for political organizations, been involved in churches, and other community-focused efforts. What he discusses is applicable, I feel, to any organization you are affiliated with. And since my audience tends to be, at least right now, people who work in corporate America, that's where my title for this show came into play. But no matter what environment you apply his message to, it's quite the useful one. Because when we talk about embodiment, as you heard discussed on other episodes of this show, we mean tuning into our bodies and how they are communicating to us, the emotions, sensations, and feelings that show up inside of us and what they mean. And when we talk about the connection between our inner lives, what's going on inside of us, our embodiment, and how we show up in the world, this is where this gets fascinating for me, and hopefully for you too. Because what Andrew is really talking about at its essence is becoming aware of your inner state, your emotions, before you engage with a group so that if you're carrying unpleasant or negative emotions, you don't overwhelm them. Or as Andrew says, blow through them with your emotions. In other words, think about this. When someone is angry at you, yelling at you, what happens to you? Do you feel reactive? Do you start to get angry and defensive in response? Emotional states are contagious to others. And if we take a few moments when we are experiencing difficult emotions to check in with ourselves and mindfully self-regulate, we give ourselves a chance to show up differently. We can be aware of or adjust our intention to show up in a way that is constructive, respectful, and inclusive, which can then open the doors to more productive conversation and an opportunity to influence your audience. That's because when your intention and emotional state are aligned with openness, respect, and inclusivity, you set the tone for others to do the same. And that leads to perhaps having more productive conversations about those really difficult issues that live beneath the surface within your organization and that no one is really willing to discuss. Anyway, I don't want to give too much away here in the intro, but I think this is a really special episode full of interesting tidbits and approaches to think about as you consider how you want to show up in your world, in your organizations, and with others. Thank you, as always, for being here with me. And without further ado, here's Andrew Lang. Welcome, everybody, to the Cope and Chill podcast. And today I have with me Andrew Lang. Andrew has written a book called Unmasking the Inner Critic, Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. And when we first connected, one of the things that really intrigued me about what Andrew has to say is the approach that he's taking with it, and how, with some of my other podcasts, we've talked a bit about how to engage your inner wisdom, your intuition, being aware of what's going on in your body. And in today's episode, we're going to build on that, and we're going to talk a bit more about what we're embodying in terms of the stories we tell ourselves, and we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, but how they can limit our ability to show up in the world, and how if we start working with them and helping to free ourselves from them, then we can show up differently and perhaps in a more fulfilling and inspiring and helpful way to others in the world. So Andrew, thank you for joining. Appreciate you being here. So Andrew, tell us, so in that introduction, we talked about, the theme that you brought up to me when we first connected was, you mentioned that how you work with people is you help them with the embodiment, as you say, and the connection, the embodiment of narratives, of stories, and the connection between the inner life and how we show up in the world. So tell us first what you mean by the embodiment of narrative, because I think that's key to a lot of what you're saying here, and central to the themes that you'll talk about.
I think one of my core beliefs, and this comes from experience, both personal and also the folks I work with, is that we don't just have narratives that live in our head, right? Like the critics.
And when we say narrative, you mean like the stories we tell ourselves?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like I'm too fat, or I'm too ugly, or something like that, right?
Yeah, these are narratives. They're the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. They're the stories we tell ourselves about our place within the world. They're the stories that we tell ourselves about the people who are around us and why they choose to be around us, or why they are, right? So I say narrative,
why we choose to have them in our lives too. I mean,
exactly.
That may be related to our narratives too, right?
Exactly. So these are all narratives that are like, why is my reality the way it is?
Yeah.
And where I think sometimes we get stuck is that we think those narratives are all cognitive. They're all just up in our heads, and I'm just kind of spinning wheels up here. My approach to this is that these narratives aren't just in our heads, that they get lodged in our bodies, or we embody them, which here's a like obvious one. When you are feeling like you are out of control, so that narrative of I'm out of control, I've got to get in control, I've got to buckle down somehow, that for me, I'll share, shows up in my body through really tight muscles in my upper back and shoulders, right? That shows up in blood pressure, that shows up in hypertension, right? So
Yeah.
all of these different ways of embodying our narratives, switching our mindset from thinking that it's just all in our heads to saying, what's my body telling me right now? How is my body serving as a flag for a narrative that I might not even know I'm carrying?
Yeah, and I think that is, so I am like the living example of ignoring what my body had been telling me for so many years. And your body will give you warnings if you are living your life in a way that is not aligned to
Yeah.
who you are or what you truly want in life, right? You may, for myself, I'll speak for myself, coming from a Catholic background, there's that thing of we're supposed to deny ourselves happiness, we're supposed to sacrifice and all of that. And so what that tends to mean is we may choose things, careers or to have certain people in our lives based on that. But then our body is taking that in and saying, whoa, wait a minute. This person caused you a lot of stress. This job causes you a lot of angst. Should you really be doing that? And it shows up in our body. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I would take another step, because what you just named as like Catholic upbringing, right? There's also the consistency of the structures that we live in. So living in a society that's driven on a meritocracy, right? Climb the hierarchy, go, go, go. Your worth is your production. What all of that does is it presses down upon us and almost funnels us so that our one way of succeeding is produce more, drive until your body burns out.
Yeah.
And what that burnout often turns into, because your body doesn't want to burn out. So what it will often turn into is it's almost like a freeze mechanism. It'll shut down and you'll go into autopilot. And what I am seeing again and again, and this is probably the core of my work, is that I think most of us are running on autopilot most of the time.
And when you say autopilot, just let's unpack that a little bit. So what do you mean by that? So we're kind of like sort of sleepwalking through life, or we're sort of enduring pains in our bodies that are probably warning signals that we're just ignoring and just sucking it up, right? And just living through it.
Rub some mud on it and keep going, right? Like I think there's the part of autopilot is not only deny everything, but just keep your head focused on what you have been told success is connected to, and completely ignore and not even pay attention to everything else. So when I talk about autopilot, there's a quote that is popping into my head right now. It's from James Finley, who's he's a psychotherapist. He was a monk for 6 years under Thomas Merton, who comes from the Catholic tradition. And one of the things he says is, if we're not careful, we can find that we are skimming over the surfaces of the depths of our own life.
Wow.
And every time I say that, I want to repeat it. So I will. So I will. We can find ourselves skimming over the surfaces of the depths of our own life. When I hear that, I think that's what autopilot does, is it puts us on the surface of a water. And in order to be on that surface, we have to keep moving. We have to keep skimming. But when we look down into the waters, we can either be so terrified of what might be in our depths, or we're so focused on staying afloat that we never look down. Or, and I think this is some of my own fears, or we can look down, notice that there are depths, and the terror comes from, what if I go down into my depths and realize there's nothing there at all? And I think that's the nihilism piece, right? It's terrifying. What's good, because it brings you to the question of what's the purpose, what's the meaning.
It takes a lot of courage to look at yourself, to really self-reflect in depth, and be willing to work with what's there and in a loving way, right? That can be very challenging, because you may not like what you find, and it may be painful, and that's probably why a lot of people avoid it.
Yeah. And I think that's the role of community. I'll name for myself, I'm so thankful to have an intimate partner who will like mirror back to me, right? And point to the depths that I have when I'm not seeing them, or point to the moments when I'm disconnected from my depths. And I think that is the power of an intimate partner. And it's the power of of being within a community, I don't mean like an organized community. I mean, who are your 2 or 3 people? Who are
Yeah.
your people that you
Yeah.
can have real talk with?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we started with, what does embodying the narrative mean? And what we're saying is that the stories that are really deep inside of us, these beliefs that either we're aware of or maybe we're many times not aware of, that we actually live out, that they're so deep inside of us that our bodies literally reflect these things on a daily basis, whether it be through pain or experience, or whether it be through patterns or habits or behaviors.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think it also shows up in how we read situations. So when you step into a room, if you're carrying all this tension that you're maybe aware of, maybe not,
Yeah.
you can read the room. We call it, what's the vibe, right? What's the vibe of the room?
Yeah.
Um, I think it shows up in, are we able to read the vibe of a room when we walk in? If we're so disconnected from our inner life, if we're so disconnected from what's going on inside, it's really hard, I think, to connect with what's going on in the spaces we walk into.
Or because we're not so aware of what's going on inside of us, if we come in the room agitated or irritated, our reading of the room is a projection of what's going on inside of us, probably more
Yes.
often than not, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll share, this is a practice I
Yeah.
start most of my workshops with. And it's exactly because of that. I started doing this. I've been a on and again, off again high school teacher for the last 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it started when I was in the classroom. But one of the practices I lead with is when folks first come in, I lead us through, a settling practice, kind of grounding ourselves in the space. And then I just invite people to name, what is the emotion that's most prominent within you right now. You don't need to tell a story. Don't go down the rabbit hole of what's connected to that emotion. Just name it. Because what I've learned is, a community, when you step into a room, the room doesn't have the right to all of the stuff you're bringing in. That's your
Yeah.
story, right?
Yeah.
And if the room doesn't have some like key components, at least like to touch base, like, oh, this person's not having a great day, or this person's feeling really joyful, then more harm can be caused. And so just by that naming of, there's 7 people in the space, there are 7 big emotions walking in here, or,
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
that can be really helpful.
Yeah. Or let me see if I can give this illuminate this in another way and say, so let's say you have a stressed out, angry parent coming home from work, and they walk in the house, and you're a kid and you're just playing there or whatever, and all of a sudden that parent yells at you and tells you to clean up your toys and all that, right? That's that energy that you're bringing into the room,
Yeah.
and what do you feel like as a result of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So okay, so, and that kind of gets into a little bit of the second part of your statement, which is when you embody these narratives, and especially if you're not aware of them, how they actually affect not only your inner life, but also how you show up in the world, right? I mean, we've just gone through some examples, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, and why you've chosen to focus in and help people in this way. What is it about the inner the embodiment of narrative and how it helps us to show up in a world that's important to you?
Well, I'll share a story, and I think this is really where it escalated for me. A few years ago, I was working on a political campaign in Seattle, and every single day, for those of you who haven't worked on a political campaign, especially during the door knocking phase, which is real fun for nobody, we 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 meet in a park early in the morning on a weekend. We get our yard signs, we buddy up, and we go into a neighborhood knocking on doors. And you're essentially selling a politician.
Yes.
You talk yourself into, I'm selling a message, I'm selling a future, but you're selling a politician is how it really reads to everyone who you're knocking on the door in the middle of their breakfast. And so I did this for several months. And one of the things I kept hearing from all of the others, I was new in this game, but all the others around me were activists. This is what they did. They went from campaign to campaign, and they all universally spoke about burnout. They either talked about it like it's already here and I'm just chugging through, or I know it's coming for me. I just need to get past the first Tuesday in November, right? Like, I just got to get
Yeah.
past the election first.
Yeah.
And what I saw in that moment was, here is a large group of people doing good work in a system that needs people who are doing good work. And yet they are disconnected from a grounding space within them, whether that is, my language for that is inherent dignity. You could talk about that as soul space, heart space, whatever grounds you so that you don't burn out, so that you don't pour from an empty, vessel, or whatever language that is.
Yeah.
And I think what's key for me is, how do we produce activists? How do we sustain activists? And I believe that we are all activists because we're all active in our communities, and communities are where change happens. How do we sustain activists and create practices that allow for that to occur? How do you bridge between the inner life and the outer life?
Yeah.
That's a really hard, it's a really hard space to be in when you are going, and you can't catch a breath. And so a lot of my work is around, how do we begin to settle those practices for folks who don't see themselves necessarily as activists? People who are just, I work at a job, I go home, I got kids. How do we develop some practices so that you can see your job space, your home life with your kids? All of those are spaces to be activist in the sense of active in the healing work of those spaces.
I was going to say, as you were talking about that, what I started thinking about was the nursing profession, which has an extreme amount of burnout involved with that, right? I mean, that's a profession is quite overloaded with stress and overwhelm. So
and there's the I mean, I shared a little bit, but I've been on again, off again teaching for the last 7 years. Why have I been off again? Because you go 3 years in a system that has become really difficult to operate within, and you burn out. And so a lot of this comes from my own processing of, how do I develop the practices that will allow my body to settle and sustain? But also at the same time, I'm leading these workshops and I'm hearing from 40-year-olds to 60-year-olds and who are sharing the exact same questions as 30-year-olds. How do I tap into a meaning that's deeper than just this, surface level?
Yeah. So what does it look like for the regular person, for someone who's not a political activist, or maybe even a nurse or whatever? What does it look like when the embodiment of their narratives, the living of their stories unconsciously or what have you, hold them back or restrict them? What would tell them that that's actually happening to them? What would they see or feel?
I think one of the
what
things
did people tell you? What did people tell you? Yeah.
I think one of the things is the people around you tell you, right? Or the people around you show you that there is a disconnection.
Like, you need to go somewhere and get help somewhere, right?
Exactly. Because that's you mentioned projection earlier. The other piece is that when we don't do our inner work, we don't, we talk about, we project our stuff onto others. That's not quite true. That's a very cognitive heavy sense. What we do is we blow our stuff through the central nervous systems of other people. Right.
Yeah.
And
yes.
Because they then have to deal with the rush of what we've put through them. And so I think that is at the core, why it's so vital to do the inner work before you walk into other spaces, and to practice inner work while you're in those spaces. Here's what I mean. When I step into my workplace, I'm currently recording from there right now. When I step into my workplace, there's issues going on. Like there are different stuff that's happening with different people, and there's structural things that need fixing. My temperament, completely unchecked, is to go in, bull in China shop, and name all the things, run through the place, cause chaos, get fired, and leave. That's never happened, but that's the unchecked temperament.
Right, that's the impulse.
That's the impulse, right? What can I do to see this space as an opportunity for me to be an activist of healing? So what can I do to settle my own central nervous system as I'm walking in through those doors and beforehand, right? To notice what emotions are most prominent within me when they spike, right? Or when my body shows a flag of, oh, you're really tense. And when I'm in that workspace, how can I name the question that needs to be named, or name the thing that has so far gone unnamed or under-examined, so that a small smidgen of healing can take place,
Mm.
uh, or so that the person who's being harmed by the issue can have someone in their corner, right, going to bat for them.
Yeah, so I think what I heard from you just now is one, and I wanted to go back to something you mentioned a second ago, but it is you're using your self-awareness for that emotional regulation, that nervous system regulation, right? And then rather than, as you use the term, I think you blow through the nervous system of other people. And what I want to unpack that for a second, because I think the way I see that is, so if you're angry and you start yelling at somebody, what that other person feels and starts to internalize is, oh, I'm awful. Maybe I feel ashamed or what have you. You don't feel great about yourself after someone yelled, but that's the conveyance of energy of anger on someone else and how they're receiving it and what it does to them. It makes them feel smaller, shamed, whatever. And what you're doing there is you're becoming aware of the energy or the emotion that you might have to share with others. And if it's not constructive or helpful, you regulate and you reframe, and then you redirect to something that's helpful and useful to someone else. So in another way, you are blowing through the nervous system of someone else, but you're doing it in a kinder and gentler and helpful way because you've reframed.
Yeah, and you're trying to hold a space. I think that's the language I often use, is like, how can we be space holders when we walk into anywhere? Instead of my stuff going through someone else unprocessed, right? How can I do some of the work of processing my pain, processing my fears, my confusions, my insecurities? How can I do some of that with me and a therapist, right? Like for a lot of us, like there's different tools to support. So a mental health professional might be really vital to this process, but how can I do some of that so that when I walk into a space, it's not just like firing through others, and I can instead come in as a person who can hold space for others who might have their central nervous systems or their stuff firing. And how can I hold that with gentle hands? I'll share one other story, because I think there's part of this, which is that we blow our emotions through others, right? The anger is an example of that. And everyone has seen that, when someone comes into a room, it's just so angry that all of a sudden we got to deal with this person who's angry, which means we really got to deal with their anger in us.
Yeah.
And there's another aspect of this, and this comes from when I was 18. I'd grown up in a church, and when I was 18, we were at the final church service, and I knew that we were going to leave. So here's a faith community I'd grown up in, and I was in the middle of two massive transitions. One was, we're leaving this community that I knew, and the second one was, and I'm leaving high school, going to college. So I was this 18-year-old boy who was just kind of in the middle of some massive changes I didn't really understand. We're in this final service, and I'm bawling my eyes out because I knew this was going to be the last time with these people, with these folks. And granted, I basically chosen baseball over church at this point in my life, but like it was still my community. And so I'm bawling my eyes out. And after the service, this guy comes up to me, and what you got to know about his name's Dale. What you got to know about Dale is that he had grown up in that church. So 60 years in that church. He was fully institutionalized. And so when he came up to me, I had known him my whole life, basically. He put his hand on my shoulder and he said, look me straight in the eyes. And he's a big guy. He says, "Men don't cry."
Oh boy. There you go.
Right? Exactly. And so the other part of we blow our stuff through others is that it's not just emotions. It's whatever insecurities, fears, beliefs he had, narratives, stories he told himself about himself, whatever he had going on inside him and had happened to him through, systems and structures that told him that he wasn't allowed to be the fullness of who he was.
Right.
He then blew that through me. So here I am, an 18-year-old boy, talking to a person I had known my entire life, who was telling me, you cannot be what your body tells you are right now. You cannot do this. In order to continue to fit into your space.
I love the way you said that, because I think, I have these conversations with some of my male friends as well. And there are definitely some that are like, men don't cry, that kind of thing. Right. And I think for me, it's not even that I wouldn't want to cry. It's like I probably have embodied that so much. I don't even know if I can,
Yeah.
if I wanted to. I mean, I certainly have, and certain loved ones have died, right? But it's become so ingrained that it's really hard to even work with that, right?
Yeah.
But I think what I loved about what you said is that it's who you are. You're a human being. The range of emotions that we have, which includes men, is there for a reason. And
Yeah.
emotions are messengers. They're communicators, and they have a purpose. And when we suppress them, it doesn't really necessarily help us. But yeah, so that's something. Yeah, that's a story to remember in terms of your experience.
It's a
But
big one.
yeah, but let's talk about, like, because you help people work with these narratives, work with these stories, and then help them free up from them so that they can live more meaningful, inspired, fulfilling lives to helping others. So how do you do that? How do you help them? What ways do you work with them to do this?
I can share a really quick overview of like one of
Yeah.
my core frameworks. So I support people in what I call shadow work.
Mhm.
Sometimes I call it somatic shadow work, and that's really the somatic piece is just the body focus.
Which shadow work is also, and I talked about this on another podcast, is
Mhm.
also similar to inner child work, right?
Yes.
That sort of going back and working with those deep repressed emotions from hurts, wounds that we've had since we were children, and that we still carry around with us and still affect what we do. So, okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
Mhm.
So a lot of the work, so in this shadow work framework, there's three different areas. There's personal shadow work, there's communal shadow work, and then there's societal shadow work. Personal shadow work is a lot of the, inner child work or parts work or internal family systems is
Mhm.
all of that kind of fits into the personal shadow work.
Mhm.
What are the shadows that I have in my life? What are the things that have been unexamined, under-examined? And what can I take a look at? That's a lot of internal work. That's pretty much everything we've talked about up to now.
Mhm.
Communal shadow work is communities that we step into. So workplaces, volunteer spaces, the schools we go to, all of these different areas, our families, right? All of these are our different communities we step foot into. Communities also have their shadows. What are the narratives or the stories or the things that go unexamined and underexamined? What are the things that in that space folks don't want to talk about?
Mhm.
Or especially the folks who have power or rank or privilege in those spaces don't
Mhm.
want to talk about.
Mhm.
And so the communal shadow work, I personally can't step foot into my community and do all the communal shadow work. It has
Yeah.
to be collective.
Yeah.
But how can I step in with a healing presence and gracefully name the thing that needs to be named or sidle up to the person who is feeling alone in that space because of what's going on? Little acts of solidarity, right? So that's one way I work with folks is like naming in our community, in that communal area, how can you do the little thing?
What are some examples of how communal shadow work shows up? Like what would that look like? Or what are the communal shadows? Let me say that.
Yeah.
What are some examples of communal shadows?
Yeah, totally. I actually just a few months ago, I asked folks on my Instagram account. I phrased it differently, but I essentially asked them like, "What are communal shadows that you've got in your spaces?"
Yeah.
And some of the things that came back were really interesting, and a
Mhm.
lot of them were, um, my mom is a part of a church. They've dwindled from 200 people down to 13. No one's talking about the real root of
Mhm.
root cause, which
Mhm.
at that point is almost certainly going to be harm of some kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something has happened
Yeah.
there, or is continuing
Yeah.
to happen. Or in my workplace, here's a communal shadow. In my workplace, we have really disconnected hiring numbers between women and men, people who are non-binary, right? And no
Mhm.
one's talking about it.
Mhm.
One person messaged me and said, in their workplace, we've hired a lot more women. They work in the tech field. We've hired a lot more women than we ever have before. That's been part of the initiative that we've been focused on the last 5 years. And yet none of those women are being promoted,
Mhm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Those are communal shadows.
Yeah.
Another one that is in a lot of spaces is just the issue of pay, right?
Mm.
So many
Mhm.
of us have been taught we don't talk about money. You don't talk
Mhm.
about pay,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so those are some examples of communal
Yeah.
shadows, but
Yeah.
there's a family one might be, your uncle is an alcoholic who is causing harm, right, in the family. Is that something that as a family, as a collective, is being talked about? And talked about might not be the right phrase, but what is the healing act that is occurring there?
Sure.
Right. So those are all examples of kind of communal shadows, and what is your part to play in that space?
And then, so how do you help people work through those communal shadows?
Yeah, a lot of it is awareness. The first step is dealing with our own central nervous system, right? First step is, how do we come into this seeing the space with soft eyes? And not eyes of, I'm going to fix everything, because that's not going to happen.
Right.
And it shouldn't happen. It's not you. It's not on you.
So maybe seeking to understand first rather than coming in and dictating. Yeah.
So see that space, seek to understand that space. And then a lot of the work I do is, all right, now what is the, I don't want to say action plan, right? But what is the next step that you can take? And then what's the step after that? And so begin thinking through tangibly, now that you are settled. And I also support people in, like, what are the practices that will help you stay settled through this process? How are you making sure that you are both doing the work in your inner life and at the same time taking the small little steps in that communal space to name the thing or do the thing, whatever that is.
So helping people, when you say get settled, so helping people maybe come with a softer attitude, a calmer mindset, and then being open to understanding, rather than being judgmental or directive. And then with that, it's then encouraging the dialogue, the conversation. Is that okay?
Totally. And I think what I want to name here is that most of the time, what holds folks back, especially in the communal sphere, what holds folks back is that saying anything is a challenge to the status quo, including the status quo that for many of us have benefited us, right? And so a lot of my work is coming alongside people and almost holding a hand and saying, yes, this is going to be uncomfortable. Here are the practices that can support you. It's still going to be uncomfortable. Like that. The practices don't save or stop the discomfort, but together I can support you in making that step, because the status quo, even if it is supporting you or not, if it's a shadow, it's harming somebody. And so what's the small step?
And so you don't necessarily have to have the entire community or organization or family or whatever it is involved. What you're helping people to do is to engage with that community in a different way than they may have done before, that in a way that they may have been limited by their narratives, their stories.
Yeah. And this is where I think a lot of my different trainings and a lot of my different interests come into play, because what I do, I think, fits really well on the individual level. Working with individuals who are part of communities fits really well if a coach in the asset-based community development community then stepped in to work with the full collective, right? Because a lot of my work, personal, like with an individual person, is informed by asset-based community development, right? So I think there's that part to play as well, which is what we can't change, fix, save things acting alone, but we can step in and change our posture, right? We can change our posture and the way we show up in the world. Hopefully, then at that point, if especially as a collective group, if someone is creating a space where that conversation can happen, even if you can't, right? If a professional comes in, maybe it's a job, maybe it's a consultant, then you'll be one less person who is carrying antagonistic posture, and that might be everything.
Yeah. And who are the people that you typically help with this approach? What do they look like demographically? Who are they? Where do they work? That kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Typically, almost everyone who comes through my workshops are between 30 and 70, usually still working or like just entering retirement, with a lot of questions around, what am I going to do now? That my job is not my defining feature, or questions of, I wanted to do something with my life and it hasn't really turned out that way. So what do I do with that? And then a lot of my folks are people who I like to say nine toes in or nine toes out of institutional religion, whatever that looks like. And I think one of the reasons that so many of my folks come from that space, one is that that's my background. I came to this because I had the question of what I was promised in terms of go to church, that's where you'll find eldership and wisdom. That didn't really vibe with my experience. And I think what I have then created is a space where lots of people who have that similar disconnection, friction, show up. So people who are either outside of the church, have just stepped out, or are still in the church, but they know something, like there's something missing. Yeah, and I think a lot of it, folks who are trying to figure out, I feel like I'm running on autopilot. I feel like I'm just going through and I don't really know what else to do. I like the idea of activism. I like the idea of getting active. I see issues and I want to be part of the change. I just don't quite know how. What's that first step?
Yeah. Really interesting. So Andrew, tell us about the book. So Unmasking the Inner Critic, Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. So tell us what it's about and why you came to write it.
So the book is in a lot of ways what has come out of workshops. I've been leading workshops for about 10 years now. It came out of the workshops and it also came out of my own personal life. I'll name that I never wanted to be an author. That was not part of my narrative about who I am.
Yeah.
What it really came out of was I kept hearing from folks and processing, oh, these are all narratives that are being carried. These are all stories. How can I, in a book form, in a tangible form, how can I share some of the practices and the wisdom that have helped me, or have come through the workshops? And so what the book is it's basically a guidebook through 9 of these different narratives. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. I am alone. And it'll share a snippet of wisdom from a therapist or a spiritual teacher, a mystic, a poet, and then it'll provide journaling space. And it wouldn't be me without the second part, which is, and action prompts, because you can't just do the introspection without the getting active. And that's the entire book. It's a first step. If you're trying to figure out what does this inner work look like that is connected to my real life, that's who this book is for.
So as an example, so coming to terms with, let's say you feel like you might have this narrative of I'm not good enough, and sort of and then journaling about that, right? Becoming introspective about it, examining it, exploring it. And then once you've done that, you're encouraged to take action, right? To work through that, right? So that you're no longer limited by that particular narrative or story. Is that a fair summary?
It's a both and, like those things have to be happening at the same time. You've got to be, I shouldn't say you've got to be. My approach is that one of the things that's vital in this work is that we are gently starting to notice the ways that I'm not good enough is showing up. And I'll name that's actually one of my core narratives. And so the way it shows up for me is that I'm not good enough lets me off the hook from trying. Because if I'm not good enough, then why bother?
That's right.
In other folks I know, it's the opposite. I'm not good enough. And so it supercharges them to try harder. And so the work is becoming more and more gentle. Hold that more and more gently. It's going to be really hard to let go of, and you might never be able to do it. But how can you hold it more and more gently, and at the same time be showing up in your communities, working in a way that isn't exuding that I'm not good enough energy, right? So for me, showing up at my office and being like, all right, I'm going to try this thing today that I've never tried before. And it's okay if it all lights on fire. Like it's okay if it does not work.
Right. Wow. So Andrew, this has been really inspiring, really fascinating. I really appreciate your time and joining me today. And I know it's been a while, took a while for us to connect and get together, but I just really appreciate all that you've had to share. And I think you have a really unique take on how to get people out of themselves and into the world, and helping them to make the world a better place, which was one of the hopes that I had for this podcast. But I'm really inspired by the approach that you're taking and helping people do that, because it feels like you're really helping them to connect with those inner limitations and working through them. So thank you for that work. I really appreciate it.
No, I love it. I think so much of this comes down to, where are we grounding ourselves? If we're grounding ourselves in our negative inner narratives and our constrictions, it's going to be really difficult. If we're finding a space to ground ourselves in our inherent dignity that can't be taken away, that opens up a lot more energy for us to dance ourselves into the world.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Well, is there, if people wanted to connect with you, is there a URL or something? Where would they go to find you?
Yeah, you can check out my website, andrewglang.com. And I have a newsletter I send out every Wednesday, and it's just very similar to the book. It's a short wisdom teaching, a couple inner work questions, and then resources to go deeper. And my email's on the website too, so you can always reach out and we can chat.
Awesome. And we'll have the links for whatever you'd like to share in the show notes when we're done here. So awesome. Thank you again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you were able to take some inspiration or something of value from today's show. To access all of the resources and links mentioned, please head on over to copeandchill.com or our video-based podcast on our YouTube channel at Cope and Chill, where you will find the show notes for today's episode. That's Cope and Chill, CopeandChill.com. And for information about upcoming episodes, check us out on Instagram at Cope and Chill. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you're joining us from YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're joining us from. Please come back and join us again for next week's episode. But until then, take care of yourselves.